It's a great pleasure to introduce Christina Schiavoni, and she's going to talk with us about food sovereignty in the U.S. context, the politics of convergence among movements. She's a food movement activist, and she is currently, she's from the U.S., but currently doing research at the International Institute for Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands. She's been deeply involved in food sovereignty efforts for a number of years, and I'm sure she'll share some of that. Some of her recent research has included an evaluation of the civil society mechanism of CFS that Dr. McMichaels talked about yesterday. And I think without further ado, I'll introduce Christina. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here at such an exciting moment to discuss food sovereignty, and I've already learned a lot from many of you. And I'd like to just briefly start out with the perspectives I'm bringing. One is that I'm at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, which is one of the institutions behind a series of critical dialogues in 2013 and 2014, critical dialogues on food sovereignty that many of you were involved in as well. And these dialogues really dug into some of the many sticking points, challenges, contradictions of food sovereignty to try to deepen and further the debates. And among the outcomes of these events are three special issues on food sovereignty. One in the Journal of Peasant Studies that came out last year, one in Third World Quarterly that was just recently released, and another in Globalizations that is just about to be released, hot off the press on June 3rd. And literature on all of these is available on the tables outside. I was involved in the co-guest editing of the Globalization special issue with Annie Shattuck and Zoe Van Gelder, and also was involved in an article in Third World Quarterly with Zoe Brent and Alberto Alonso Fradejas. So I will be bringing some of the key messages from those into this discussion. And today I've been asked to focus in particular on food sovereignty efforts in the US. And I have to warn you here that I'm not looking at this from the outside in as an impartial observer. I have been involved in some of these efforts through some of the initial years of the US Food Sovereignty Alliance. Who here is familiar with this alliance? Great. Well, just for those who aren't, very briefly, this came out of efforts in the midst of the food price crisis of 2007, 2008, when all sorts of alliances were unsavory, alliances were being formed among corporations, philanthrocapitalists, and we weren't seeing enough alliances happening among progressive food and farm movements in the US. So there was an effort to unify progressive groups into a more cohesive and powerful movement, and to situate this movement within the global movement for food sovereignty, which we heard from yesterday from our wonderful speakers. So I'll be drawing upon this experience, even though for me it's a few years dated and there's much more work that has transpired since I've been involved. And as we emphasize in our article in Third World Quarterly, food sovereignty efforts in the US span far beyond the US Food Sovereignty Alliance, but we examine the USFSA as a key site of convergence. So for the rest of the time I have, I'm going to focus on 5 main points. And the first has to do with the embeddedness of food sovereignty, or to quote Andrew quoting Phil, that food sovereignty is going to be different from place to place. There is no one food sovereignty. So in Venezuela, which is where I do much of my research, where over 90% of the population lives in urban areas, food sovereignty is about a process of co-construction among urban and rural movements. And there's a growing movement of prosumidores, which is trying to blur the line between producers and consumers. In Hawaii, which Claire Gupta has written about, food sovereignty involves combining indigenous struggles for self-determination with engagement with the state in the fight against GMOs. In Russia, there's a quiet food sovereignty that's flying under the radar of the state that Visser et al. Discuss in the Globalization special issue. And in Chicago's South Side neighborhood, survival mechanisms passed down from the Jim Crow era, like collective food purchasing, are sowing seeds of food sovereignty in the aftermath of slavery, migration, and deindustrialization, as Melissa Figueroa lays out in her very excellent article in Globalizations. So Figueroa and others like Isles and Montenegro DeWitt, who were mentioned yesterday, and others are making the argument that a more relational approach to food sovereignty is needed, one that moves away from ideal typified notions of what food sovereignty is or isn't, focusing instead on how efforts to build food sovereignty change the ways in which power is structured and experienced in people's everyday lives. And this allows us to see that food sovereignty does not have to, and it cannot, look the same everywhere. And this diversity is not a product of ambiguity or confusion about what food sovereignty means. Rather, these differences are the product of local histories, identities, cultural memory, and political moments. So connected to that is point 2, that the spread of food sovereignty into particular contexts is not unidirectional. It's not about superimposing this globally articulated framework onto a particular context. Studies are increasingly pointing to a dialectical nature of convergence, recognizing that the global food sovereignty movement is indeed shaping local struggles, but these local struggles are also shaping the global movement. And so when we talk about food sovereignty in the US, we need, or anywhere for that matter, we need to acknowledge that it's not arriving to a blank slate and let's create food sovereignty, but it's arriving to a complex landscape of historically entrenched power structures and diverse forms of resistance. And these all have to be taken into consideration if we're going to talk about food sovereignty in the US. And I think this was captured really well in an event in 2008. That was one of the events leading up to the founding of the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, called Step Up to the Plate, Ending the Food Crisis. And there, standing on the stage were probably people that many of you know, LaDonna Redmond, an incredible urban food justice activist, yeah, LaDonna, Ben Burkett and John Kinsman, family farm leaders, Gerardo Reyes, a farm worker activist, Pat Purcell, a food worker activist. And LaDonna made the point that achieving a just food system is not about going back to some idyllic past, because there never was a just food system in the US. The food system was built on genocide of indigenous peoples, on slavery, on forced migration, on other forms of oppression. So if we're trying to have a just food system, we need to build something radically different than what existed in the past and what exists at present. And something important about this event is that it brought attention to existing movements that are often invisibilized in the dominant narratives, in the mainstream portrayal of the food movement I know we've all seen of mainly white, middle and upper class, largely urban foodies, which invisibilizes a whole host of actors, those people who are actually on the front lines confronting issues of injustice in the food system every day. And these are the movements that I would argue form the basis of food sovereignty in the US. So in the Third World Quarterly article, we tried to look at some of these movements, one of which is the movement for agrarian justice. Although there's not necessarily a movement that calls itself by that term, we used this to describe movements of family farmers around land and around the ability to benefit from the land. And digging into the history a little bit, you can see divides around race and around class that reflect very divisive policies. But fortunately, there are groups working to overcome these. The National Family Farm Coalition and many of its members trying to look at both corporate consolidation in the food system and issues of land loss and discrimination faced by Black farmers, for instance. But farmers comprise less than 2% of the population in the US. Numbers are not in their favor, so they cannot carry forward these struggles alone, and therefore strategic alliances are very important. We also looked at food justice, and this connects to some of the issues that Andrew was just raising. Struggles mainly of communities of color who are facing poor food access and disproportionate rates of diet-related disease, directly connected to issues of structural racism that are pervasive in this food system. And looking a bit at the food justice movement, we saw both some tendencies towards depoliticization, where even Walmart is trying to get in on the action, but also some very exciting and promising moves towards radicalization. For instance, adopting tactics from the civil rights era and a convergence of mobilizations like Black Lives Matter with food justice. And I just want to point people to an excellent article in Yes Magazine in January written by Penniman, which features Monica White, among others, who we'll hear from later. A third often invisibilized movement is that of immigrant labor justice. Often food and farm workers are completely left to the sidelines when we talk about the food movement in the US, and yet together they comprise nearly 20 million workers in the US food system when we talk about farm workers, slaughterhouse workers, restaurant workers, grocery workers, warehouse workers, etc. And although it's hard to get the exact numbers because of their undocumented status, many of these workers are undocumented immigrant workers who consistently endure lower wages, higher rates of wage theft, and higher rates of food insecurity. So those are the three we looked at, but we acknowledge that there are other critically important struggles, like Native American struggles for food sovereignty as part of broader struggles for food sovereignty, which was covered in an excellent recent piece by Gray and Patel. So point number 3 then is that food sovereignty in the US, and I would argue elsewhere, is about a process of convergence. There are all these different movements, they have their own complex dynamics within them, and then how do you actually bring it all together? And yesterday, Annette spoke about the importance of struggles connecting. So I would argue that food sovereignty in the US is about how these movements and others can come together and articulate a common vision, a vision that's informed by the broader global movements for food sovereignty, but that's rooted in these particular contexts that I've mentioned briefly here. So building a food sovereignty in the US then would mean doing the hard work to overcome some of the deeply entrenched divides that exist. And this really means digging into and coming to terms with the history behind these divides. And I think one of the important roles of the US Food Sovereignty Alliance is at least, and other similar mechanisms, is at least providing a space for some of these conversations and dialogues to be able to happen. And I'll just share 2 examples that stand out in my mind. One was a discussion, Malik's not here yet, is he? No. Okay, but I think he'll be here later. One was it was at the Community Food Security Coalition Conference several years ago, a session on food sovereignty that Malik was one of the panelists. And at the end, Joel Greeno, a young dairy farmer from Wisconsin, he's a 5th-generation dairy farmer who recently lost his cows, actually, stood up and said, "This was great and powerful, but most of you are coming from an urban perspective. How about family farmers? Are we part of this picture?" And Malik said, "We're under no illusion that we can do this alone, and the urban food movement must unite with independent family farmers like you guys." And I felt like I could feel the seeds of revolution in that room. And just one other example was an exchange between Rosalinda Guillen of Community to Community Development in Washington State, which is a farm worker group, and John Kinsman, also a family farmer from Wisconsin. This was at the Growing Food and Justice Initiative conference talking about dismantling racism in the food system. And Rosalinda was struck by hearing John talk about the struggles of farm workers and said she had never before felt like she had an ally among farmers, and that was a new connection that was sparked there. So it's kind of providing the space to have these conversations to be able to move forward more as a unified movement. So point number 4 then is that, just building upon what's already been said, we really can't talk about food sovereignty in the US without talking about racism and without talking about white privilege. And this came up really clearly in some of the early conversations around the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, which started at the U.S. Social Forum that took place in Detroit in 2010. And some of the, particularly the people of color-led groups that were involved, said, you know, we have to look at the racism that's throughout the food system, but we also have to look at the racism within these movements and who's in positions of power, representation, who's speaking for whom. So this conversation started a whole series of dialogues that continue to this day that are reflected in the founding documents of the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance. But there he is, great. But a lot more hard work has to be done. And I think the movement has to ask itself, especially right now when Black Lives Matters in the media, these connections are being made, is the movement going to really get behind this in a real way and really try to confront issues of white privilege and racism? And obviously I say this as someone who benefits from these things, so it's a very personal as well as political work that has to be done. And then the fifth and final point is also the centrality of immigrant labor struggles for food sovereignty in the US, both in terms of numbers. There's just many, many workers within the food system, and in terms of mobilizing strategies. Some of the most innovative and exciting organizing work that I think we can all learn from is coming out of food worker struggles in the US. For instance, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, I'm sure most of us know about them in Florida, taking on some of the major corporations in the food system, and many, many other examples. And here I want to point to the work of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a tremendous effort to unite workers across the food chain, from farm workers to restaurant workers, warehouse workers, many others. And Food Chain Workers Alliance was a founding member of the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance. And they've helped to bring some important perspectives, particularly about some of the everyday realities that their members face. And this is also reflected in an article that is part of the Critical Dialogue series by Mayer and others, Mayers et al., who talk about the very real challenges to try to work towards food sovereignty among farm worker communities in Vermont, where one of the major barriers is people are afraid to leave where they're living because they're at daily risk of deportation. So how do you work towards food sovereignty when that's the reality? And it's really important if we're going to move forward, that the food movement, the rest of us, try to understand these realities and get behind some of these struggles. And one little promising step forward is that the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance has a working group, a trade and immigration working group, that has come up with immigration principles for food sovereignty that's available on the USFSA website. So in closing, I just want to say that just as movements in the US have much to learn from the global movement for food sovereignty, and that is happening, I didn't really talk about that here, but incredible exchanges with leaders coming from all over the world. Just as there's involvement in the Neil Laney Food Sovereignty Forum that we heard about last night, and bringing some of that back into our context here. So just as there's much to be learned from the global food sovereignty movement, the ways in which food sovereignty is being articulated, negotiated, and debated in the USA can also be instructive for the broader movement, particularly as it seeks to expand into urban contexts and to reach new populations. So I'll leave it at that and just welcome any questions. Thanks.
So we have 8 to 10 minutes for questions, so come on.
Thank you very much for your talk. That was really, really inspiring. I think my main question is just related to the fact that you begin by stressing the importance of differences among these movements and how this does not imply ambiguity and something blurred in this definition. And at the same time, you're calling for a kind of a common understanding and coming together. And I wanted to ask a little bit about that. How is it possible to have both, to maintain these differences and to work in these differences? Because food sovereignty is based on those differences, and at the same time finding a common cause, a common definition, or
Absolutely. Thank you. I think you've hit upon something really important that also others in this room can speak to this very well. But I think one thing is recognizing these differences and still within them, not invisibilizing them, not erasing them, but really learning about them and then trying to say, okay, what do we have in common? At the Neil Laney Food Sovereignty Forum of 2007, there was a very good format because there were many different sectors and regions and people involved that said, okay, what are we for? What are we against? And what can we do? So this kind of process of coming together, I think Annette has written about the concept of unity and diversity. That's very important to La Via Campesina organizing structures. Sorry if I'm misquoting it. And Peter has also written about the Diálogo de Saberes as a way of sort of navigating some of the tensions within movements. So there are these systems in place, but there is no one way. And I think part of this learning process is learning how are these differences and tensions navigated among movements, and how can we do that here among ourselves. So it's a great question, and I think it's something that's a work in progress, and I welcome others to share their perspectives on that. Thank you. Yeah, please, Annette.
Well, do movements in the U.S. differentiate between food justice and food sovereignty? Are they the same? Is it important to make the difference, or is there a difference? And if there is a difference, do movements who are? I mean, one of the questions I'm often asked is, well, is it important that people use the term food sovereignty? What if they're not calling it food sovereignty? What if they're calling it something else?
Yeah. Okay, there are a few things in there, and you've also put some good ideas out there about this. On whether or not it's called food sovereignty, I'm a huge fan of Melissa Figueroa's article. If you haven't read it, it's so good, in the Globalization special issue, where she kind of makes a point, to paraphrase her, whether or not it's called food sovereignty is kind of beside the point. Let's look at what people are doing coming from their own realities and their own histories that's so informative to broader food sovereignty efforts. So I think that's one really important point. And then about food justice and food sovereignty, it would be great for some of the people in the room engaged in these issues to speak to that themselves. I feel like these conversations are happening. Eric, who's here, has also written some really good stuff about it. And I think in some cases there is a weaving together of food justice and food sovereignty. I've been with visiting campesinos from Latin America in New York City urban gardens, where there was no disconnect. It was just like, wow, like people just connected and got it, and it didn't matter about words. And then there are other instances where those words do matter. So sorry to not really answer that, but it's a really important point. Yeah. I think we're almost out of time, but yes?
I just want to reemphasize, I think the end point here, in some of the work that I've done in Chicago, one of the really important points is also ensuring particularly that white groups and white-led groups are not taking over and implying language or using the terms that work for them to characterize or even to build bridges with other groups in the city. And so this question, again, that I think other speakers have talked about the idea of self-definition, about that form of sovereignty, to identify this in particular ways, and to have other groups that have less power be able to also have priority in making the connections and making those things both at a sort of intellectual and political and material level. So just making sure that that's sort of also at the forefront of our intellectual, political project.
Absolutely. We white people have a lot of work to do. Yeah. to put it lightly. Anybody else? Final questions? Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much.